Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Bank of Baroda Betak for this session, The Art of Innovation, with Tilly Blyth, Payal Arora, in conversation with Tarun Khanna. Just to let you know before the session starts, they will be signing their books after the session, so if you want to take your books to them for signing, if you have further questions, you can ask them there. The signing tent is out of our building to the left near Mughal tent. Without further ado, please welcome our panel to the stage.
Good morning. Welcome to this amazing session called The Art of Innovation. I would rather have titled it The Art and Science of Innovation, but what do I know? I'm Tarun Khanna, very pleased to be here, and my role is to serve as the moderator of what I hope will be a scintillating conversation. We have two panelists who bring diverse perspectives on a perennial issue of really what is innovation. Innovation is a word that's much used, somewhat abused, overused. It's easy to be cynical about it, but it's also easy to recognize that it's extremely important to the way societies function. How could it not be? On your far right is Tilly Blyth, who is the chief curator of the Science Museum in London. For those of you who have been to London or are frequent visitors to London, it's on a lovely street, whose name I always forget, but I remember now, Exhibition Row. It's along with the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and Imperial College, and the Museum of Natural History, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a perfect geographic setting for the topic of this panel, because the panel is about the art of innovation and the science of innovation, so to speak. And on the V&A, for those of you who know the origins and provenance of that street, it's all about the mixing of art and science. So it's particularly opportune. On my immediate left, in the center for you, is Payal Arora, who is a professor at Erasmus University and has written a lovely book called The Next Billion, which she'll talk about, I'm sure. And in a sense, when we were conversing online and in person right before this, we realized that even though they've come to these issues from completely different vantage points, there's a lot of interesting overlap, which you'll see. But what's interesting about it is they're completely different empirical domains in some sense. And that kind of makes it fascinating, two fascinating looks at the same rather profound issue. I'm a professor at Harvard as my day job. And I teach a class that curiously turns out to be related to this at Harvard College, which is called Creativity in Economic and Social Development. And I co-teach it with a medical doctor, an architect, a jazz musician, and a mathematician, just to illustrate the mixing of art and science in problem solving, so to speak. But without further ado, the way we're going to do this is Tilly is going to show some slides and talk through her points, and Payal will do the same. And we'll keep our introductory comments to no more than 10 or 15 minutes, have a little bit of a conversation, and then reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So, Tilly, all yours.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and it's really delightful to be here at the Jaipur Literary Festival. I've never been to the festival before, but I'm just overwhelmed with the number of amazing ideas, the level of interaction from the audience, and I think especially on the first day it was so delightful to see school groups here at the festival engaging at this level with literature. So thank you so much to Sanjoy and to the JLF team for inviting me to be here today. So as Tarun said, I'm here to talk about the relationship between science and art. And this really came from a project that we started as a major partnership, a landmark partnership with the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company in the UK, and the Science Museum. We started talking to them a few years ago about this relationship between art and science and how we might do a variety of different products that would come out of talking about this relationship. So we did a 20-part radio series, And that was with my co-author and co-presenter, Sir Ian Blatchford, who's the director of the Science Museum in London. And that went out in September, and you can also still download that from BBC Sounds. And I'm surprised you could seem to be able to download it in India. I tried it yesterday, so that was exciting. We also published this book, The Art of Innovation, and that talks about those 20 episodes. And then there's a free exhibition at the Science Museum, which sadly closes tomorrow. So if you haven't seen it already, it's pretty unlikely you'll be able to get there for it. So I think for me, this was a deeply personal reason for wanting to go into this subject area. I had two parents who were both art students. They both went to art college. They would endlessly drag me around art exhibitions, and yet I had a yearning for science, and I did a physics degree, and I've always found that these two worlds to me are not separate. To me, they've always been part of who I am, and everything I approach and all the stories that I tell about the history of science and technology, I see them as completely intertwined. I think when Ian and I and my colleague Roger Highfield, who's also in the audience, he was involved in our early stages of this discussion, we were thinking about this relationship between art and science, and we really felt that, as C.P. Snow had said, this was two cultures, his famous two cultures debate in 1959. We felt that that was very wrong, and we felt that actually this is two parts of the same culture, and it's much more helpful to both scientists and artists to think about where the collaboration is and where their intersection is. So that's really where we're coming from, and we want to think really about how they develop and define each other. To me, science is very much a human activity. It's not, rational and dispassionate. It's messy. It's driven by a desire to succeed. It's driven by competition, by egos. It doesn't happen in isolation to society. And hopefully, I think that comes through very strongly in the 20 chapters and the 20 stories that we told through the radio series and through the book. So I'm just going to touch very quickly on two of those stories to give you a sense of what it was that we were, trying to get to and trying to talk about. So if we could bring up the first slide, please. So this is, many of you from Britain may already know this image. This is Rain, Steam and Speed by J.M.W. Turner from 1844. Absolutely stunning image. You have this locomotive hurtling towards you, as if driving into the audience and going through this extraordinary, almost impressionistic scene of the rain and the steam driving forward. And it was Turner's opportunity to really look at this sense of progress as new railways were driving across Britain. To go on this locomotive, this is called a Firefly locomotive. If you traveled on this in 1844, you would have been traveling faster than anyone else in the world at the time. You'd be going over 60 miles an hour. So Turner was trying to capture this incredible sense of progress and of change and of innovation. But I think it's also quite interesting if you look in more detail at the image. You see on the left-hand side, you probably just be able to make out a tiny little rowing boat. So very much the technology of the past. And to the right, on the far right side, just above the railway, is this plough. And you probably can't see it in the image that I've shown you, but if you're in front of the painting at the Science Museum or in the National Gallery where it normally hangs and where they've kindly loaned us this painting, there's a tiny hare running in front of the train. So all of this is harking back to this nostalgia of the past, these things that have moved on and have come to be. But to me, this is very much Turner expressing not this nostalgia and this fear of change, but actually this enthusiasm for new innovation. And I think there's ways that we can look at this painting that help us reflect on our own experience of change today that we're seeing with so many new things like the mobile phone, the increase in data. So it's really about what constitutes progress and the fear and excitement of change. Now, I just wanted to highlight, we are putting all of the scientific objects alongside the paintings. And again, this is quite unique. I think, to me, it seems extraordinary that so many people may have seen Turner's Rain, Steam and Speed, but they've never seen this beautiful model that was made by Daniel Gooch. He was the superintendent of locomotives for Brunel, for the GWR. And he was so proud of what he'd made that he created this 1/8 scale model of the Firefly locomotive. So this is this beautiful copper and brass locomotive with these tiny rivets and rosewood. This actually works, so he would run this around his office to show people, you know, this great feat of engineering that he had created. And hopefully, another slide. And this is just the locomotive with the painting on display in the exhibition. So you can see how we've displayed it almost as kind of coming out of the painting, as if it's going to run you over. It kind of almost captures the Lumiere brothers, you know, that sense of the train coming out of the screen when they first showed film, and the horror and shock that people felt when that was moving towards you. So I wanted to move on to a second story that's not so much about progress and about this sense of innovation and change, but actually this looking more detailed at the relationship between artists and scientists and how they both think, and the kinds of process that they might use. Because I think as I said, we tend to think they're very separated. You know, science is about empirical inquiry, art is about passion and understanding. But I think, actually, if you look through time, you can see points where artists and scientists are very much intertwined, and the way that they're working with imagery is very similar. So this is a nice story that I can tell you about a man called James Naismith. He was actually an engineer. He created something called the steam hammer, a very important piece of engineering that was used for manipulating very large pieces of cast iron. And he would, you know, manipulate these. And he made millions, became very, very rich from this discovery. And he went off and he retired to Kent in the southeast of England. And in his retirement, he studied the moon. He would sit at night looking up at the moon. And he made these meticulous and beautiful drawings of the moon. This is one. It's a painting that's about 2 meters by 2 meters high. And it's utterly stunning painting. It was shown at the Great Exhibition in 1851, which was the exhibition that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert came to. It was actually the founding of the museums that Tarun talked about on the exhibition road. And Naismith was given an award by Prince Albert for this extraordinary painting because they believed it to be so accurate and so beautiful. And it was this that brought Naismith to the attention of many people. And he did these meticulous studies of every part of the moon. So at night, he would look at things like the craters here and do lots of studies of them. And he also, there's the next image. Yeah, he would also recreate these craters in plaster of Paris. And he was doing this in the same way that you might see, you know, plaster models of great sculpture. He believed them to be, you know, really a replica of the real thing, very close to the real thing. And he would light these images and recreate pictures of the moon. So here you can see this 3D sculpture, but then he would light it and cause shadows so that he could photograph his models and create pictures that looked just like what he saw through his telescope of the moon. And it was these images that were published in a book that he called The Moon, a World, a Planet, and a Satellite. And these were revered by scientists of the time. So the Norman Lockyer, the editor of Nature magazine, a very important scientific magazine, said that these are no more truthful a representation than could be found anywhere else. So really stunning pictures. So I hope that shows you that in many ways, the way that we work with images and the way that we mediate images, both in art and science, are totally interrelated. And I think he gives us a great example of that. So those are just the two stories. I'll hand over to Payal now to talk about her perspective of innovation and art and science. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I think I'm going to take the thread of the railways and take it in a very different direction. So I live in Amsterdam, and I travel to the UK quite frequently. And my work is about decolonizing technology. So I talk about colonization and the new kinds of neo-colonization happening in the data sphere, right? So usually I come into this very awkward conversation with people in the UK and some British scholars like, well, at least we gave you Indians the railways, right? So, and I'm like, yeah, thank you. And indeed, it is an awesome innovation. And we are ever grateful for the century and plus of introducing us to this amazing technology. But also, we shouldn't forget that the railway was a systematic way in which colonizers could rape countries, their colonies, across board from their raw resources and made themselves rich as a result. So when we look at innovation, we really need to look at it in context to the social situation at hand and move away from celebrating or, sort of looking at it as a tool that is going to destroy you. So, next slide. Yeah, so I'm a digital anthropologist, and it's basically a fancy way of saying I look at what people do with digital media and how do they make sense of their everyday lives, right? And my book, basically, which has come out last year, was about an accumulation for more than a decade of digital anthropological experiences, particularly in low-income contexts in India, Brazil, South Africa. And part of what I'd like to talk about is one of the arguments I make is what we need is less innovation for the global poor. Now, to make this statement seem so blasphemous in this day and age where people are so in love with the term innovation, every country is trying to be ahead of the innovation game, right? I mean, if you don't innovate, you're going to die as a society, as people. Parents are worried because you won't get automated, you won't get replaced if you're creative and innovative. And yet, the way in which innovation has been construed and designed for the marginalized majority, which is the global poor, have been actually devastating to these populations. And here's an example. Next slide. So, how many of you have watched this movie, Gods Must Be Crazy? All right, so you guys are quite old, right, like me? So it's a proxy for what's the age demographic here. So yeah, I can see that. All right, for the majority of youngsters, not me, and you guys who raised your hands. So this was a crazy movie. It was basically this Coke bottle dropping from the sky, and this tribal community in Africa was like, what the hell is that? And so they're like trying to figure it out, this amazing innovation. Is it a rolling pin? Is it a musical instrument? And the movie goes on like, exploring this new technology in the tribal community. So there's this guy, Nicholas Negroponte. He is one of the tech evangelists of our era, one of the most influential technologists. And, he founded MIT Media Lab and so on and so forth. And in early 2000s, he's standing in front of the Silicon Valley Summit, thousands of people, and he's like, I have an idea. My vision is I'm going to throw these laptops and tablets from the sky in the Kalahari Desert, and these tribal communities are just going to run and love it, right? Now, if some idiot told you this on the streets, you're like, my God, why isn't that person in an asylum, right? But no, there was a standing ovation because, my God, what a bold statement to make. So one of the things is about innovation has so much come to mean disruptive innovation, radical disruption. It's not incremental. You have to blow the place up, right? Next slide. Yes. His co-companion, another evangelist, right, a tech evangelist, Sugatha Mitra, came up with another brilliant idea. Get rid of schools, get rid of teachers, put a hole in the wall, put a computer in there, Kids will teach themselves from math to biology to chemistry. And he is, again, deeply celebrated. And, it's been a decade of failures in terms of his proven studies, and yet he and, Negroponte sit on the boards of some of the top, innovation summits, innovation incubators, and financial corporations, such as XPRIZE, right? And who is behind it all? The third element in the wheel is Elon Musk, who also is great at radical disruption, who proposes that yes, sure, climate change, the planet is going to shit, so why not move 1 million people to Mars? That's a great solution, right? So here's my first point. Technology as disruptive innovation, we really got to get away from it. We need to see it in terms of how it's impacting people's lives and making meaning from them. The second point is that, this idea that novelty is inherently good. When we think about innovation, we think about progress. All the positive connotations come to mind. But how many of you guys have used this app, L'Amour? I mean, after all, it's a #1 dating app in India. Do you guys not have a romantic life? No? Well, guess what? It's not a surprise that nobody's raising their hands. This is actually, I was alerted by a journalist a few days ago saying this is a #1 app and this is an entire scam. There are intermediaries who have populated and gamed the system to push reviews and have made it the #1 app in India. And so these young boys and young girls, particularly boys, get online desperate for love because, hey, guess what? In India, we have 63 million less women because of gender bias, okay? On top of it, you have men who are fed on Bollywood romances, and less than 10% of this population is going to have a love marriage. So they are full of the Bollywood hormones, and they want romance. And innovation is driving. If you're talking about digital media, you're talking about romance economies, nothing else. Pornography and romance. And what this app is doing is it is basically hooking you with all these sexy girls, connecting with you, and says, if you want to connect with me, you need to subscribe. And that's how the story goes. And the third and last point before we go into this conversation is that we need to stop thinking about innovation as a product. We seem to think that's the most important thing, which means that all the innovations that trickle-down technology comes from Silicon Valley, it comes from the West and goes to the rest. We need to think in terms of process innovation, because then we will see a lot of in-house innovation happening across for the longest time, right? Many of you are familiar with the Dhabawala system in Mumbai. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of tiffins circulated with 30 seconds of stops to load it, unload it, to make sure it reaches all these different places way before any of the mobile tech even took place. How on earth did that happen? That is brilliant. That is the logistical innovation which appears extremely mundane and incremental and boring and doesn't get captured. And then we have this falsification that product innovation is what matters. And I will leave it at that, and we can get talking more. Thank you.
Thank you both for those lovely introductory comments. I have so many questions, but one point of commonality between two very different empirical bases of inquiry is the idea of immersion in the phenomenon in some sense. So your last point, Payal, about not forgetting the process, right, and being immersed in the phenomenon with the next billion users or whatever your domain of inquiry is. What I take away is less of an opposition to innovation per se, but more of an understanding of how the technology interacts with the users who may be reacting very similarly or differently from what you're used to in the past. So to have some kind of humility with that subject base. And in your case, I was thinking of immersion, trying to immerse myself when the locomotive first came into being, as depicted in that lovely painting, Turner painting. So let me pick up in no particular order, but maybe start with you, Tilly, if I may. You mentioned the extraordinary thing that this is both a book, This is a book, an exhibition, and a radio show. From your vantage point in the Science Museum, can you comment about, and you alluded to the now famous, infamous C.P. Snow lecture back in the 1950s in Cambridge, I think, talking about the separation of the sciences and the arts and the lack of advisability thereof. Can you comment on how science is received by the British public or the public as they traipse through your museum? How do you see that process of scientific understanding or literacy?
Thank you. A good question. The reason we approached it in this way and to use those three different types of media is we felt that ultimately a science museum like ours is very, very good at telling great stories. That's what we try to do, and we try to engage people in science, in scientific understanding, through those stories, through the people they might meet, through understanding the relevance of science in their lives. So we call this concept really scientific capital. We're trying to not teach them science, that's what teachers and schools are very, very good at doing, but try to introduce science into every aspect of their lives so that they feel more confident with science, so that they feel like science is something for them. And to understand that science, as I said, is a human activity. It's something we can all be part of and we're all party to. So by taking the book, the radio show, and the exhibition, it was three different ways of really bringing visitors into that scientific conversation and to open up their scientific capital. And a radio series is a great way of telling some good stories, bringing in other opinions, but importantly for a museum, an exhibition is a great way of actually showing you the real thing. You can see the real artifacts or the great painting up front and actually learn more from it as evidence in front of your own eyes.
I think a radio show would be great in India that communicates science literacy. So Payal has had a very illustrious past. I didn't know this from her bio, but she was mentioning to me that she used to be an art dealer. So when you were at a wonderful juncture of the artist life and the scientific life in some sense. Do you want to comment on this issue of how one should think about innovation from both the art and science perspective, drawing on your two very overlapping paths, if I may?
Sure. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Absolutely. My CV is built on a series of failures. So I was a failed artist, and as my father will testify, that I actually ran away from home, ready to set up some new dimension, new school in a Marxist artist village in Kerala. Clearly that didn't work out. Then I went to be an artist in San Francisco. After 3 years of poverty, I realized I don't think I care for poverty, so screw that. So, let's just say there's a whole series of failures until I arrived at what I'm actually passionate about. But what I'd also learned is initially I would purge that from my CV. You can't even see anything of it. And only in recent years I'm reclaiming it because people don't read it as valuable and they don't see it that it is really intertwined. Because what it does is the arts make you inherently irreverent. There's nothing sacred. You cannot think about things in sacred terms. So when you break that dimension, anything, especially when you enter the sciences, because it is so much in silos. There's so many like divas and egos and subsects, and one linguist won't talking to another linguist, and an artist is all about disrupting all these sort of prescribed boundaries, because that's how great ideas come about, right?
So that's a lovely word, irreverent, right? And I think of a good scientist as being irreverent. Because, of course you want to do incremental science, you want to test a hypothesis that's already out there, but the ultimate thing is if you come up with your own thing, and for that you've got to be irreverent in some sense. So that seems to me a point of commonality in some sense between a good artist and a good scientist. And, going back to the moon depictions, paintings, models, etc., what I was again struck by is again a very scientific aspect of that artistic endeavor. which is the idea that you keep on drawing it and you keep on iterating your way until you capture the likeness of the moon, which is, again, what a scientist does. You keep refining an experiment, you keep changing, tweaking things, because it's that process of immersion in the phenomenon that gets you closer to the phenomenon that you want to understand. Yeah?
I think that's just as relevant to the way we look at images of other galaxies and other planets today. You know, I'm talking about a publication that's from 1871, but actually, you know, the way that we interpret images from the moon today, or the way that we look at things from the Hubble Space Telescope, all of that is data that has been interpreted, has been, you know, refined, images that have been colorized, been edited, cropped. So there's just as much, you know, personal interpretation in the imagery that we see of the moon and the galaxies today. I think if you think about the image of Earthrise, you know, the image that came back from the Apollo 8 mission, the first time that we saw the Earth from afar, we saw our own planet, completely transformed the way that we all felt about the planet. It's interesting that it's called Earthrise because actually the way that that image was taken was with the Earth to the right-hand side. Now, we all see it now rotated through 90 degrees with the Earth below and you know, the atmosphere above. But actually, you know, even from that first image, that was manipulated in some way so that it gave us a different interpretation of our place in the universe.
You know, I'm reminded of a lovely article that I read in the Atlantic magazine by Walter Isaacson. I forget the title. It was something like, you know, how did Leonardo make the Mona Lisa smile, or something to that effect. And really, it's a meditation on the use of science by the artist, Leonardo, right? Saying that each anatomical detail of the Mona Lisa as it finally is depicted is the result of extraordinary scientific investigation. Really amazing, and you can see it in the sketches in the notebooks. Let me turn to more contemporary issues, moving from the 1800s and colonialism and so on. But I'm thinking about the implications of some of this conversation and your own work for innovation, the way it is understood, correctly or incorrectly, by contemporary organizations, right? And you must have thoughts about this. Payal, do you want to, either in, you know, companies or universities or what have you, what are some of the misunderstandings, if you will, about the idea of innovation that you would point to and admonish us all to pay attention to?
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts. One is, you know, when you talk about moving away, whether it's from colonialism or the past, I would actually say, on the contrary, we need to remember that the history is our future. And this is, I'd like to push that point a little deeper, going by what Tilly was saying, is right now we have a sort of disrespect for the past. We don't feel we can learn enough about the past, right? And I'm talking about in the scientific circles, we have a crisis of the lack of reproduction studies that are happening. And we're talking all the way to the hard sciences, right? People are not reproducing and retesting scientific theories, certain kinds of genetic testing, etc. All these tests, because it doesn't yield a Nobel Prize, it doesn't yield a publication, because all you're doing is affirming somebody else's, you know, little experiment, which makes us build entire new institutions, policies, medical regulations, and infrastructures around experiments. And this is one of the biggest crises that it doesn't get underlined enough. What we need to do is decenter innovation. Innovation is not that important. When we think about it in terms of novelty, what we need to do is recenter all the tweaking and adjusting. Because if you think about Facebook and MySpace, how different were they both, right? MySpace and Facebook were very similar except for a little tweaking. Facebook quickly understood that if you allow people to select the friends and create their own communities, then people will like it, because nobody wants to be part of a generic mass. And so that was a little tweaking, going by what Tilly's talking about, these little twists, a little like tinkering, this constant process of tinkering. Because the way in which we talk about innovation is very fictionalized. We say something is innovative, but we're actually putting a benchmark, just like history. We're like, this was the beginning of World War II. Really, was it? You know, this was a groundbreaking technology that changed our lives. Really, was that? And so it's actually the collective tweaking and tinkering across the years that makes it meaningful for us. And I would emphasize that because otherwise we're really going down the wrong path.
Just picking up on that, I mean, I would completely agree with Payal that, you know, this idea that you're saying about disruptive innovation, that actually, you know, we need to move away from this disruptive innovation. But to me, it's slightly recast it and actually say, well, maybe we're talking about this word innovation, but we're not looking at it in the right way. To me, so much of when we talk about innovation is actually about the moment of invention. It's not about that longer term adoption and creation that happens once the inventions happen. So actually, you know, we need to take that long view, and we need to understand that innovation is over decades and centuries. It's not over months and even weeks in the tech industry. I think we're being sold a bit of a line, you know, that we always need to chase the new thing, the big shiny, you know, latest operating system or whatever it is. But really, if you look at technological history, you can see that so many of these technologies are adopted and changed by us, the consumers. It's the users that really define these technologies in the longer term.
So that's an excellent point that both of you are making, that it's sort of a continuous process of multiple people coming together, not an epiphany usually of one thing. I'm reminded of an empirical study that I saw. I'm forgetting who did it. Social scientists in the U.S. who collected data on new things going back centuries, and his quest was to basically ask, from the first moment that X appeared, how long was it before some plurality of society adopted X? And the answer, as I recall, was an average of multiple decades, not just a few months, and including things that we would today, think of as quite mainstream and mundane. Even those had lead users, so to speak, who then tweaked that particular innovation, shared it with others, and society collectively came up with what ex post we would classify as an innovation, so to speak.
I mean, look, here we all are because of books. We're here because of books, one of the oldest pieces of technology. The introduction of the telephone and the television didn't get rid of books, and thankfully email isn't going to get rid of books. These are technologies that are here to stay.
Yeah, I mean, even podcasts, right, are basically reviving the practice of listening, oral histories, and then radio. And every new technology, people are like, okay, then, when the radio came about, surely, people will not read, people still read, and everything there's almost like a death sentence of the past every time a new technology comes, right? I mean, think about one of the proclamations by Edison saying, with the light bulb, we don't need schools. Because people will look and study on their own, and they don't need the death of the school system based on a light bulb. And so let's not get swept by the hubris and arrogance of innovators. That's the other thing, right? Because they will sell you, whether it's like Elon Musk, who will convincingly say, screw this planet, say goodbye to it. Actually, why not just increase it and exhaust it, and let's move to Mars, right? The same kind of deep arrogance that drives us in the opposite direction. And we really have to, but it's also extremely seductive because it gives you this very futuristic something, right, that you can hold on to and you can fall in love with. People just don't fall in love with the incremental, the tweaking. It sounds boring, right? I'm like an okay person because majority of us are just mediocre. And that's okay. We don't need to be fabulous to be happy. So, I mean, the thing is, we're so in love with these super everythings, these, extrapolatives of life, that we miss out that the real elements that really become meaningful in our everyday lives are these very mundane, ordinary things.
So Payal, are you against Elon Musk type of characters?
No, really.
I mean,
if he
what's
proposes
wrong?
to me, I'd marry him, yeah. So,
No, I mean...
but I'm not moving to Mars. I mean, we can have
you
one
say
home
that,
there, one
you know,
home
yeah,
here.
you don't know that for a fact, right? I mean, surely it's not either or. I mean, you know, society needs crazy guys too, right? We
Yeah,
need,
but
we
the
need
thing
people
is,
pushing.
yes, people say this, but it comes at a tremendous price. Like, you know, the one laptop per child, it lost millions of euros of low-income communities in Africa and Latin America. And people are like, listen, this is a price of innovation, but at whose cost? It came, so it was 100 euros. People don't realize it's a trade-off. It's not a supplement over an education system. So what we had was, during the one laptop per child era, for a decade, the poor African children, Latin American children, lost out on entire year of schooling because their budget was 100 euros. So either the government bought a laptop for 100 euros and they told the kids, enjoy for the whole year, no teachers, no schools, no textbooks, or they could have invested in people, teachers, right? And that is the reality of the situation. We don't have limitless money. We are always constrained with our resources. So I'm sorry, that's what I mean. It's like we need less innovation because it's coming at the cost of the marginalized majority. Majority of the people are low income, poor, and cannot afford to lose out on the basics of life, right?
So can I try a different moderation of that and see if it works for you? So on the Negroponte example, when I think about listening to you articulate it, and I watched it unfold in my backyard, so to speak, at MIT, my issue is not so much with the craziness of the idea, personally. Mm-hmm. It's with the governance of the execution of the idea. So what should have happened is Nicholas tried it, put the stuff out. It clearly failed in a couple of locations. The governance should have been strong enough to shut it down, right, and stop wasting the money. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult for me to sit here and say, okay, there's going to be a bunch of crazy ideas, and we're going to shut them all down because they all sound crazy. I'd rather have a world where we have crazy people, but then we have governance processes that prevent them from exploiting vulnerable populations and so on. So it seems to me that what we need is, let me be provocative, more innovation. We need more innovation in the governance process, so to speak, to curtail faulty experiments, rather than saying, let's shut the visionaries down, which seems to me to be a colossal mistake in and of itself. So we're running out of time, but let me go to Tilly, because you were going to say something, and I interrupted you.
Don't get me wrong, I am not a Luddite. I do not want to stop innovation. I do believe that we need this technological progress, but I think it's very much about thinking about the human agency and the human control and the human input into that innovation. So, what worries me about the kind of things we see with Negroponte is that you're thinking about us all as passive consumers, that this technology is dropped in and it transforms us all and, we will go away into this wonderful future. That's not going to happen. This is we need to be actively engaged in this, and this is why it's so important that, the generation today is learning to code, is learning to understand data, is learning to be part of that conversation, not to just be, given these technologies and told that we must get on with them.
So let me give Payal the last word, if you want to say something, then we can open it up.
Yes, I mean, look, if these innovations are so damn fabulous, why don't they experiment on their own school kids? I'm talking about the wealthy ones, right, who can afford to take the risk. And here's a good marker. Actually, some of them did fall in love with their own ideas, like the experiment of Alt School, which is in Silicon Valley, where they thought, oh my God, this really is a great idea. They drank their own Kool-Aid, so they set up this where their teachers became data crunchers, and kids were given playlists of curriculums. Within 2 years, the richest of rich Silicon Valley parents, we're talking about a project funded 50 million euros by Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, the who is who in Silicon Valley. And the next thing you know, they're like, oh my God, we don't even need cell phones in classrooms. Let's come up with a new thing. Parents are protesting, it's shut down, And that was 2 years. But you know what? They could afford it because those kids are getting all kinds of other learning and they will be successful because they have rich parents. Just don't experiment and use low-income populations as live laboratories for your testing of technologies.
So that's what I would call governance of the process, and I agree with that completely. Okay, let's open it up. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. I'm just going to call on you in the order that I see your hands go up. Roughly, the lady in the front, yeah, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is to ma'am. As you said that innovation should be reduced comparatively for the sake of the marginalized section. So, but don't you think that investing both in human resources or the existing demographic dividend and along with the innovations side by side, don't you think that will help in a more fairer development?
Absolutely. I mean, the problem is, like, so for example, Kei-Fu Lee, right? He is a major AI guy, and he was asked in Europe just recently. He's the head of Google China, right? And he was asked that, can you give us some tips about the future of innovation? He said, I'll tell you, if you really want to be an innovative nation, you need to go to countries like India, countries which have nothing, and do your experiments there. This kind of logic that poor countries are blank slates with nothing to give, they're just waiting recipients for being rescued, is extremely damaging because you actually undermine the human resources at play. They are so resilient, so creative, and that is not being invested in, right? So the mentality is we give technology versus we co-work with them to create meaningful technology that works for these people, who probably have already pioneered it anyway, right? So absolutely.
The gentleman in the green, yeah. Could you get a mic? Yeah, thank you.
I think this question is for you, Payalji. Just one thing. Don't you think the adjectives like radical, disruptive, to use them with innovation is a bad precedent? Innovation is innovation. Innovation, in a way, is a positive word, and as the other speaker said, it's up to the society how to take it. And you take it over a period of time. You decide whether innovation was good, bad over a period of time. So, rail, take an example of rail. Maybe that time the idea behind rail, as you said, was because Britishers wanted to loot. But over a period of time, we know now in 100 years, 200 years, what rail has done to us. So this is the question, sir. Using these words like disruptive and radical innovation, it's kind of, demeaning the meaning of innovation, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps both of you could comment on that. Yeah, do you want to go ahead first? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Now, see, if words were just existent by themselves and we could, create meaning with them, that would be one thing. But every word comes with loaded connotations and often biased towards certain kinds of interest, right? So innovation is very much got a positive bias. And the fact is, any technology is basically a mirror of human ingenuity. So like the railways, it has the enormous potential to connect families, businesses, and it basically is as wide and as creative a human being is, which is infinite. That's how much a technology has its potential. To the most insidious, like the neo-Nazis using it, and the Nazis using it to transport Jewish communities to the camps, right? So, yes, it is basically a mirror to us of what we are capable of in both the good, bad, and the ugly.
I mean, I would completely agree with that. To me, this isn't just about throwing technologies in, it's about ensuring that the way that technology is implemented and regulated enables empowerment and enables communities to take ownership of that technology and define how they want it to develop for them.
Frontier, get a mic.
Tarun, this is more of a comment to what you said about the speed at which technology is adopted. And yes, it took a long time. Radio, for example, took 80 years before it was widely accepted. But in India, and with new technologies, we have a completely different situation. I would say that we have one mobile phone per family of a technology which is only 20 years old, long before we have one electricity connection per family, of a technology which is 150 or 200 years old. So the speed of adoption is changing. And to the point about technology being thrown down at people, yes, I think entrepreneurs would love that. You know, if you could throw technology down and it gets adopted, but that's not the way, as Tarun would know, entrepreneurship works. For every entrepreneurial effort to put a technology out into the market, there are 99 which fail. So we are suffering a little bit here from a sort of a survivorship bias. You can't throw technology down. Unless it responds to needs of people and people adopt it, it's going to fail.
So if I may augment that, maybe a way to say it, consistent with Payal's view, is that you have to pay attention to the human agency of the user in some sense. And if it turns out that this is something that the human being rejects, it's very hard to see it disseminate. Let's get, how much time do we have? We have 10 minutes, okay. Let me see, let me get something from you. Back there, yeah. I'm just trying to spread out the comments.
So my question is for Professor Khanna. You very successfully managed to straddle the worlds of academia and entrepreneurship. And I was curious to know what formative experiences early on in your life have contributed to making you personally innovative.
Well, I mean, I would just say that being an academic is to me the same as being an entrepreneur. I mean, you know, it's that same point. I love the word that you use, irreverence, right? I mean, even as an academic, you're always kind of looking for something different to say because that's your currency, is unless you have something new to say, then, you know, that's not very interesting at the end of the day. So
unless you're tenured, and then you can become rotting wood, so.
Yeah, well, that's the downside of the incentive system. But I really don't think of, I mean, you know, as the last comment also suggested, trying to do something entrepreneurial is like trying to publish a new paper. It's just against different constraints that are pushing back on you. In one case, it's the adopter that says, no, we really don't like your stuff. In the other case, it's, you know, referees of journals who say, we really don't like your stuff. So you kind of iterate your way through it in some ways. But let's get a few more. How about the gentleman in the corner there? Yeah.
So Singapore was a country that's always embraced innovation, and then North Korea is a country that's always shunned innovation. So let's assume there is a price of innovation. Is there a bigger price for not innovating?
I think you wanted less innovation. So.
Yeah. You know, we're talking about how innovation has been construed. So I was hired by UNESCO sometime recently to do a project on what counts as innovation in developing countries. And what I realized, and I was shocked by, is that basically it's synonymous. When you say innovation, it's synonymous with technology novelty. But actually, that's not. Actually, Tarun himself has said there's about, you know, a variety of different innovational streams. Like, institutional innovation is so important, and we're not giving enough credence for that. Process innovation. So there's so many, and there's a rich literature and brilliant case studies about the varieties of innovation that needs to be equally valorized. And it's not just technology, and technology works in tandem with the others, as this gentleman has said, otherwise it won't work. But the question is, who can afford to fail, right? So when an innovation keeps sticking around, either it's because people have no choice, or because if it's much more open market, then it is because it did not consider that innovation is, like, it was very myopic, that it didn't consider that it is multidimensional, right? And so, indeed, that is the price, is astronomical failure. But, you know, the bottom line is people are extraordinarily resilient, and in spite of all this, so I mean, that has given me some hope, right? So.
Yeah, so just picking up on whether there's a price for not innovating, I think we will find out very shortly with the catastrophic climate change that we're experiencing now. We don't really have any choice. We need to innovate, you know, to challenge ourselves with this major change that is coming. And, you know, there is plenty of evidence that this is a real thing. We can't sit back and carry on as normal. We need to find new ways of dealing with this. So as I said, you know, this message is not about being a Luddite, but it's about ensuring that that innovation happens within the right forms of regulation and with support of communities so that new forms of technology are actually adopted in the right ways.
I'll just remind you that the Jaipur Literature Festival is an innovation. It occurred, what, a decade plus ago? 13th, yeah. So 13 years ago, it was an experiment. It was an innovation in getting people together to discuss books. And it's an example of something. There was a lady at the back, all the way at the back, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Payal, this one's for you. So we just spoke, as in we heard about jobs, we heard about Musk. So there is also work happening around the world, for example, Bill Gates' sanitation program, right? Mm-hmm. And if that actually happens, that I would define as disruption, right? So my question is if affordability and capability can come together in doing, which is actual disruption. So what's your view on that? And there is, I would say, large work like Bill Gates Foundation, which is spoken of, and there is also smaller work happening. So there is UN programs, there is a scientist in Siberia running his own lab studying global warming. So this work is also happening, and somewhere everything will come together. Each of these in some form is, I would say, disruption. Any views on that?
Yes, of course. So, you know, I'm not against disruption. I mean, I was an artist. I mean, you're supposed to go against by default, right? What I'm saying is it's like this, you say this move fast and break things, right? The sort of mantra of Facebook. We love the breaking of things, and we've fallen in love with that, particularly because it's such insidious, corrosive institutions in place, right? Corruption, etc. We are unhappy with that. But what we're not putting equal attention to is move slow and build things. Every time you disrupt, you need to also build, right? And I mean, just look at it in terms of an analogy of war, right? You bomb the shit out of a country and you decimate it, and either you have a Marshall Plan, which actually creates a Europe, or you don't do anything in which you create new forms of terrorism, right? So the idea is, as if you're going to break things, you better come up with a formula for also building things. Because otherwise, you are leaving us with nothing, right? And that in itself is not okay. It's not enough. And I think that I've deliberately taken a stand to create that pushback, is have it both in tandem, right?
We have time for maybe one more question. Could you, yeah, this gentleman right up here in the front, maybe. Please keep it crisp, yeah.
As evidence suggests, humans have been wired to overreach. How do we limit the human spirit which finds passion in innovating? That's the first question. And if the population of a country or a certain region chooses free market, how do you curb the growth which disruption brings about? Because that means the people are readily accepting the disruption. So by curtailing the innovation, you'll be also curtailing the growth. So how do we balance that, and how do we exactly balance compelling the spirit, human spirit?
Let's take one or two more quick, and then panelists can choose what they want to respond to. Somebody back here had their hand? Yeah, right there, right behind you here.
What I understood is the problem is the speed of innovation, not the innovation per se. That's what you've been trying to say, that, how fast should we innovate? Should we wait for the one innovation to, establish itself and then go for another innovation? But who is going to control the population of the world? I mean, that is making the whole of the climatic changes, and for that you have to counter through innovation only. And we have to be very, very fast in those innovations. We cannot be slow.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to comment on either or?
I'm not going to comment on human population, but I do think there's a bit of a myth about this speed of technological change, that we need to each time question that. Actually, it's become this kind of mantra to our world. But to me, I don't see that much difference between online shopping and mail order, or the email. Actually, the first email was sent nearly 50 years ago. It's actually quite relatively old technology, and we're only just understanding the impact of things like email. So I think we just need to just take a step back and always question, is this all so new, actually? Is it?
Thank you.
We don't have so much a problem with people per se, because I think that's a big myth, you know, this Malthusian myth of overpopulation. We have a problem with people's actions. And so if you act in a way which creates good education, you allow for the well-being of people, people will naturally curb their families. It has an effect, right? We are starting at the wrong points. So we should look at actions. If you're talking about the sustainability of planet, our actions are doing more damage than just the reproduction of human beings, because actually we are the biggest and the best resources that we could ever have on the planet. People are an asset. They're not a burden or an obstacle that we need to overcome. And we need to turn it around. And countries like India and China have tremendous diverse assets at their disposal, which is their people. And we should stop thinking that these are the biggest burdens of society, but start to think responsibly about how do we enable them to, going to your point, to enable them for the maximum human flourishing that can possibly happen.
On that happy note of maximal flourishing, please join me in thanking our panelists for a stimulating conversation.
Thank you also to INOX for supporting the session, and again to Tilly Blyth, Payal Arora, and Tarun Khanna. Can I just remind everybody that it's the last night tonight of the music stage at Clark's Amer. Tickets are available at the box office, which is by the entrance in the fountain area. I'd love to see you all there for a really great night. Thank you.